Okay, so for the end of April, I'm thinking more in the lines of recycling and upcycling. So I've been collecting some heavy-duty tubes. These are kind of things that fabric normally comes on, so it's quite a decent thick side on these. I've got 3 of those, and I've also got half a dozen stackable crisps, or stackable chips, you know what I mean, boxes. So I'm going to use those to make some boxes. I've got some larger food tubs as well. Locally we can't recycle these because of the foil lining, so I'd like to find another use for them. I did this some time ago with a small batch, and now I've got quite a lot to do. So first I've kind of gone through the numbers and worked out how many I can make of each size. I'm going to do a couple of sets of nesting ones and a couple of sets that kind of sit with each other the same size, same diameter. So it's kind of little, medium and large. So what I've done is I've put some tape on to stabilise it slightly, and I've marked these are 10 centimetres, I've got some 8 centimetres, so just so I've got these lined up and ready to go. I'm not going to cut the centre point yet because this is thinner than the other stuff and it's got a lot of movement and flex to it, and if I try and cut this section here, that's just going to collapse. So what I'm going to do is cut this to size, so I've got 2 boxes connected, and then stabilise this end with a lid with a solid piece, so it's like one solid box, and then cut them in half, hopefully. And it's going to slow down each kind of stage of this, because this one piece is going to be the pot and the lid, so it's the same process repeated. So I'm going to cut off, or cut to size, and then stabilise this top, and then cut in half and stabilise these 2, and then cut the 2 pieces apart, which sounds a bit of a palaver, is a bit of a palaver, but this way I can actually get a decent amount of use out of one tube. So I've got a reverse tooth blade on here. It's quite a thick one, because I think this is going to need it, and this is obviously too thick to go underneath my blade, so I've got to lay it against the blade and line up my marks here and just rotate as I cut until I get all the way through. It should be fairly simple, should. So I'm now going to start on these large tubes, and this one had a ding in the middle. I've kind of marked that bit to get rid. So I'm going to start somewhere in the middle here so I can get this down to a manageable length, because it's a metre and a foot, 1 metre 30, 1 metre 40, or thereabouts long. So this stuff is fairly thick, and you can see it's made up of kind of layers of wrapped cardboard. Again, you can use a hacksaw on this, but I still find this the better option. So I'm going to start again lining up. I've only put 1 mark on this, so hopefully I can keep it straight. And I'm just going to roll it towards the blade. This is just under 2 inches, so it should be possible to get it all the way through. If not, then I'll just kind of roll it round like I did with the other ones. So I think I'll switch to... No, I'll do this one live and then I'll switch to time lapse for the rest. That's cut rather neatly, and the layers of card haven't separated at all, so that's going to be fairly stable for what I'm going to do with it. So now I'm going to continue cutting these down in pairs so that I can... Actually no, I'm not. Because this is so stable and there's no flex in there at all, I'm actually going to do these individually, which is going to save a lot of work. So I'm going to start on that, and I'll switch to time lapse because I don't think you want to watch this many individual cuts being done at normal speed. I'm working my way through all of these tubes, putting on tops and bottoms. Now for these smaller ones, they're fairly thick, it's about 3mm thick. I don't really need to kind of reinforce them, so I'm just using some thin card and just placing them upside down to kind of set with their own weight. With these thicker ones, this is almost, there's more than 5mm thick, so I don't need any kind of reinforcement, and all these are quite small on this this thickness of tube. So all I'm doing is dabbing some glue around this cut edge and just sticking on a bit of card. Now this is card from the back of pads and that kind of thing. I call it construction card because that's kind of what I use to make prototypes of things with. So I've got tons and tons of it because I go through sketch pads quite quickly. So that's easy enough to cut by hand and use for this. For these tubes I've used an old painting board, which I never used. So, and that's quite a thick bit of card here that should hopefully give that some stability, so that I can then put that through the saw again and just cut in half. So these need to be trimmed back and then reinforced, and I'll show you that later. Okay, so I'm moving on to my larger pots here. And these are 12 centimeters tall, so that is pretty much ideal to use one of these as a kind of lift for the lid to support it in the centre. So these come with a plastic lid, which I'll use later on, but to start with I'm just going to draw around the bottom of the box, of the pot, because I want to get a lid that will fit onto the rim and not into it as much as possible, because I can't glue the lid directly to this foil surface, and if I try to kind of sand it off it just causes a complete mess. So I've cut my circles close enough, I'll just trim them round. So that's going to fit just on the top here and not drop inside. And to stop it and also give the centre some support, I'm using one of these, which is 12 centimeters tall anyway, so that sits in the middle and it will support the centre of the lid here. And just to hold it in place while I'm moving on to the next bit, I'm just going to put a couple of bits of tape just across the sides. I don't want too much tape because that's going to stop everything else from sticking. Just cut the strips just to hold it in place like that. Now here I've got some PVA and water. It's a standard kind of crafting mix, it's 50-50, and I've got some strips of fabric. This is just some scrap cotton and old bed sheets. So you could use paper if you want to, but I think this is going to be slightly stronger over a longer period. So being fairly generous, I'm just going to ladle it on the, ooh, make sure that tape's stuck. I'll ladle it onto the outside here so that I've got something to stick on. Now this doesn't need to look in any way elegant, it's just to make the bond between the top and the bottom. Whereas with the cardboard ones, it just kind of sits on the card. This needs a little bit extra. So just lining the fabric up about 1/2 inch. So now I also have a really long cardboard tube. It's 2 meters long, which is the same diameter as this, but I've got these already sitting in the back of the shed, so I'd rather use these up than start cutting that thing, which is going to be a bit of a beast to cut anyway. So I'm just going to dab more glue on the end here so this sticks. And now to kind of settle this into position, it's going to saturate the bottom edge of the fabric here so it's well glued onto the side of the pot. Now I'm not going to use, I'm going to completely cover the outside of this pot, so the look isn't important, it's just the strength I want here, because this is still fairly thin cardboard. Now I'm going to ladle it in on the inside, and then starting from one end, pull it down and brush it down. It's not going to sit flat, so that's not a problem. So I'm just going all the way around, just adding more glue to make sure this is saturated with it. That's why it's got the water mixed in, so it actually goes a bit further. Oop. So. Brush around so that's all kind of sitting in neatly as possible. And then using the original lid. Okay, so as I hope you can see from the camera here, my blade is at right angles to the table, but the table itself is very far off of level generally. But that's because my nice bit of heavy duty foam here has just collapsed. So I'm going to have to do something with that at some point. But as long as I'm keeping all the work at the minute level to the table, that shouldn't be a problem. So I've got to work on a new pad base. Using something similar to this, it's going to stay paddy for longer, I think. So all I need to do at this stage is separate these ones in half, because this is nice and solid. The fabric has created a really good bond here. These bigger ones I cannot get anywhere near the blade like this, so I'm going to have to do these either by hand or with a Dremel, which will be interesting. I used a bit of a jig with my drill press in order to cut the lids off of the larger ones. You can see here there is a huge selection. I've got a dozen kind of sets of little and larges, and then 6 of each of the nesting sets. So I've got plenty to work through. I'm using some of this dark green cotton fabric. You could use paper if you wanted to, you could paint it if you wanted to, but because the nested boxes are old containers generally, it's difficult to get a decent finish if you try and paint over the printed side. So I go for a fabric and that just does the job. And then I'm using a technique I've used quite often, which is essentially just weaving of paper and ribbon. Now I start with an old book. This one is, I believe that's Aristotle's Politics, and just work around weaving in and out as you go. I normally mix in some ribbon with the paper, because the paper on its own doesn't have much strength. You can't really give it, you can't pull it tight. So, hello Jake. So combining it with ribbon helps to add some kind of tension to it, and a little bit of colour as well, just to kind of pop through. And then for the top rim, I've put on a line of thick ribbon and sewn that through the cardboard, which is a lot easier for the large one and the middle sized one, because that's thin cardboard. Obviously you couldn't do that on the smaller one, so I've just kind of gone through the layers up to the cardboard, and that's as far as I can get, and just work around, weaving in and out as you go. I normally mix in some ribbon with the paper, because the paper on its own doesn't have much strength. You can't really you can't pull it tight. So, hello Jake. So combining it with ribbon helps to add some kind of tension to it, and a little bit of colour as well, just to kind of pop through. And then for the top rim, I've put on a line of thick ribbon and sewn that through the cardboard, which is a lot easier for the large one and the middle sized one, because that's thin cardboard. Obviously you couldn't do that on the smaller one, so I've just kind of gone through the layers up to the cardboard, and that's as far as I can get. How to recycle some cardboard tubes into something slightly useful and kind of pretty. So I'll see you next week.